Okay, ready to get started here? I'm hearing an echo.
Me too.
What'd you
Yes.
say? What'd you say?
Has the echo gone away? Yes, it has. Okay, echo's gone.
Yay.
All right, we're going to get started. We're halfway through, we're 3 of 5 of the lessons on between the testaments. So far, we've done the temples, and then last week was the Maccabean revolt. And that gave us an introduction to today's lesson, where we were introduced to the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and found out that they came in response to the Hellenism that the Seleucid rulers were trying to push on the Jews. So today we'll get into more detail, quite a bit more detail on the sects or parties within Judaism. Our sources will be the Bible, and then the works of Josephus, Jerusalem in the time of Jesus, and then just a short one from Charles Pfeiffer's Between the Testament. The works of Josephus will tell us about how do you become like a Pharisee or an Essene, and then Jerusalem in the time of Jesus is an excellent source for living as a scribe or a Pharisee or an Essene. So it'll give us background on what their life was like. The sects we'll be looking, there's 4 of them. Pharisees and Sadducees, we're familiar with those from the Bible. The Essenes, typically know them as the people living in Qumran and the Dead Sea Scrolls. And then the Zealots, there was one apostle of Jesus that was referred to as a zealot. Terms used, various terms, sects, parties, denominations, divisions, heresies, philosophies, and schools of thought. Now, none of these had originally any negative connotations for them. They were all pretty much just used for divisions, that sort of thing. Today, we hear the term denominations for various churches, and parties like political parties. But none of these had any negative connotations at this time. But over time, a couple of them, sects and heresies, received a negative connotations with respect to the 2 terms there. The Greek for the sects or heresies was heresis, and it meant a religious party or faction or sect. Here's the verses that goes along with them. And the one negative one there is, you see, is number 2, false teaching or heresy. And that's in 2 Peter 2:1. And even there, the term heresy isn't negative, but it's negative because it has the adjective destructive in front of it, destructive heresies. And these groups were actually Christians who were false teachers. Another term was meros, and a religious party, and that's in Acts 23:9. We see in the dictionary that today's sect does generally have a negative connotation to it. This is Webster's Collegiate Dictionary, a dissenting or schismatic religious party, especially one regarded as extreme or heretical. So we see here both sect and heretical have negative connotations to them today. And then here's from Charles Pfeiffer. We mentioned this last week, that the rise of the Jewish sects was in response to the Hellenism that the Seleucid Empire was trying to impose upon the Jews, where some of the Jews embraced Hellenism, gladly embraced it, and that those tended to be associated with the Sadducees, and the pious Jews who were against it, Hellenism, those tended to be the Hasidim or the Pharisees. So what we know from the Bible, Pharisees and Sadducees, this is Mark 7:1-4. This concerns their fastidiousness for ritual purity. Now, when the Pharisees gathered to Jesus, with some of the scribes who had come from Jerusalem, we see here that scribes were generally located in Jerusalem. They saw that some of his disciples ate with their hands that were defiled, that is, unwashed. Now here, Mark gives us, we have in our Bible a parenthetical couple of verses on what the Pharisees did. For the Pharisees, here's something interesting, Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they wash their hands properly, holding to the tradition of the elders. And when they come from the marketplace, they do not eat unless they wash. And there are many other traditions that they observe, such as washing of cups, pots, copper vessels, and dining couches. Now, we read about that today and we say, what's wrong with that? Cleanliness is next to godliness. I mean, today, especially with COVID, we want to wash and disinfect everything. But at this time, they weren't doing it out of cleanliness, but they were doing it because of tradition. Tradition. There's a song in Fiddler on the Roof, tradition, very important among the Jews. Acts 23, 7, 8, and 9. And when he had said this, that is Paul, this is Paul before the council, and when he had said this, a dissension arose between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. Now, Paul had mentioned that the only reason he's under trial is because of his belief in the resurrection. And he gets the two fighting against each other, and then that gets him free. For the Sadducees say that there is no resurrection, nor angel, nor spirit, but the Pharisees acknowledge them all, the resurrection and spirits. Then a great clamor arose, and some of the scribes of the Pharisees' party stood up and contended sharply, "We find nothing wrong in this man. What if a spirit or an angel spoke to them?" So Paul uses the situation there of the two divided parties to get them to fight against each other, and then he goes free. There's also another one which Josephus doesn't mention. It's only mentioned 3 times in the Bible, twice, once in Matthew, twice in Mark, generally in the context of the Herodians being one of the groups that was sent to try to get Jesus into a trap. The Pharisees went out and immediately held counsel with the Herodians against him on how to destroy him. Now, these two, these are strange bedfellows here, because generally the two are against each other. The Herodians support the Roman government and Herod, whereas the Pharisees are against them. So this is probably a case of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Both were opposed to Jesus, so they used this to both go together. What about the Christian sect? This is Acts chapter 24, verse 5. Paul is being held in Caesarea Philippi by Felix. He's under house arrest there. And the Jews from Jerusalem are sending a contingent to bring charges against Paul to Felix, the Roman governor. And they say, "For we have found this man a plague, one who stirs up riots among all the Jews throughout the world. And he is a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes." Sect of the Nazarenes, of course, Jesus grew up in Nazareth, so that's likely where this came from. Sect of the Nazarenes, they're a follower of Jesus of Nazareth. And then this is Acts 24:14. "But I, Paul, confess this to you, Felix, that according to the way, which they call a sect, which the Jews call a sect, I worship the God of our fathers, believing everything laid down by the law and written in the prophets." And then we go to Acts 28:22. This is after Paul has been brought to Rome. And after he'd been there 3 days, the Roman Jews came and visited him and told Paul that, "Well, we haven't really heard anything about your case or anything like that, but we have heard about the Christians, and we desire to hear from you, Paul, what your views are. For with regard to this sect, we know that everywhere it is spoken against." We've read where, the Christians have turned the world upside down. So the three Jewish sects, we're going to get into Josephus here. He'll be our guide here on basically what it took to live as one of the, well, to become one of these. What did it take to become an Essene or a Pharisee? He was a Jewish priest and an author. He was born Joseph ben Matthias, Joseph son of Matthias, in Jerusalem in AD 37. So he would have been born a few years after Pentecost. So the beginning of Christianity, when it's going out into the world after the persecution started by Paul or Saul of Tarsus. He acquired his Latin name of Flavius from the Roman Emperor Vespasian in the year AD 71. This is 1 year after the destruction of the temple. Josephus was, I guess, with the Romans, trying to get them, the Jews to surrender and not have to be, attacked by the Romans, but he was unsuccessful. He claimed his priestly lineage through a priest called Jehoiarib and Hasmonean lineage. Last week we learned that the Hasmoneans or the Maccabeans also claimed their priestly lineage through this same priest mentioned in 1 Chronicles 24:7, when David divided the priesthood into the 24 courses. Jehoiarib was the leader of the first of the 24 courses. And he claimed, Josephus claimed his lineage through Hasmonean lineage through his great-great-grandmother. Josephus briefly mentions Jesus, John the Baptist, and James, the brother of Jesus, in these places right in here in his Antiquities of the Jews. Interestingly, it was the Christians, not the Jews, who preserved his writings for us today. The Jews, especially the Zealots, hated him. They thought he was a traitor in working with the Romans. So the Christians likely preserved his writings because he does speak favorably of Jesus, John the Baptist, and Jesus's brother James. And Josephus is also a good source here because he says he personally experienced each of the three sects. When he was 16 years old, he wanted to experience each of the three and then decide which one he would become a part of. So beginning with Josephus, at this time, there were three sects among the Jews who had different opinions concerning human actions. Here's something interesting. He describes the differences not because one of them believes in angels and the resurrection, but because they had different opinions regarding how people behave. So the three are the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Essenes. Now for the Pharisees, they say that some actions are all the work of fate. I won't go through this. I've summarized them down here. The Pharisees believe that people's actions are the result of both what they do out of their own power and as a result of destiny. Some things they have in their power, some things they're just thrown upon them. They have no recourse. The Essenes believe that people's actions are a result of fate or destiny only. People have nothing really to do with it. It's out of their control. And the Sadducees say, no, fate has nothing to do with it. Everything that you do is in your own power. It's of your own will. Now, this is where Josephus states he tried all three of them. When he was about 16 years old, I had a mind to make trial of the several sects that were among us. The three sects, the first, Pharisees, Sadducees, and the third being the Essenes. For I thought by this means I might choose the best if I were acquainted with them all. So try them all and then see which one you want to be a part of. So I contented myself with hard work, and underwent great difficulties and went through them all. And we'll see it is hard work to become member of one of these sects. So we'll look at the Pharisees. Now for the Pharisees, they live meekly, or they live modestly. They're not high up, they just live modestly. They despise delicacies in diet, and they follow the conduct of reason, and what prescribes to them as good for them, they do, and they ought earnestly to strive to observe reason's dictates for practice. Sometimes it's hard to read, Josephus. They also pay respect to the elderly, those that are in years, nor are they so bold as to contradict them in anything which they have introduced. And when they determine that all things are done by fate, all things are done through the destiny, they really don't have any control, they do not take away from the freedom from men of acting as they think fit, since their notion is that it hath pleased God to make them a temperament, whereby that what he wills is done, but so that the will of men can act virtuously or viciously. This is certainly not what we tend to see with regard to their actions concerning Jesus. They're quite willing to condemn his actions. They also, now here's this resurrection, they also believe that souls have an immortal vigor to them, and that under the earth there will be rewards or punishments according as they have lived virtuously or viciously in this life. This goes along with what Paul says in 2 Corinthians 5:10, where each of us will stand in judgment according to what we have done in the body, whether good or bad. So this belief of the Pharisees goes along with that. But that the former shall have power to revive and live again. Those that live virtuously shall live again in resurrection, on account of which doctrines they are able greatly to persuade the body of the people. So the people are happy with this teaching, that if they live virtuously, they can be resurrected and live again. And whatsoever they do about divine worship, prayers, sacrifices, they perform them according to their direction, inasmuch as the cities give great attestations to them on account of their virtuous conduct. And we see that in the actions of the people during the time of the Gospels, when the Pharisees say to the people something, when Jesus says something to them that they're question or whatever, they go to the Pharisees and tell them what Jesus has done. So you want to be a Pharisee. What do you have to do to be a Pharisee? They had strict rules of admission to get into it, which shows their character as a closed society. Before you could become one, there was a period of probation, and the length of the period, depending upon which school or which house you're doing your probation in. Is it the house of Hillel, which had 1 month, or the house of Shammai? Shammai was the more strict of the two parties. Hillel was the more gentle, kinder and gentler of the two parties. And we see that in Acts chapter 5, where the disciples, the apostles, come before the council because they're teaching of Jesus. And one of the council members, Gamaliel, who's respected by the people, he had more of a reasonable approach, and he said, leave them alone. If what they're teaching is not good, then it'll go away naturally. But if it's good, if it's of God, then we'll find ourselves fighting against God. Now, Gamaliel was a grandson of Hillel, so that's the more modest of the two. And since Saul was trained by Gamaliel, so Paul was also likely of the school of Hillel, the more moderate of the two. Josephus states how he submitted himself successfully to each of the three, and finally at the age of 19, he chose that he would be a Pharisee. This example confirms that there was a probationary period, 1 year or 1 month, depending upon which of the two houses you did your probation with. And then over this period, the 1 month or the 1 year, the candidate committed himself to observe the rules of the community. And then you take your pledge before a scribe that you would live according to these rules of purity and tithes. The purity, the ritual washing, the washing of hands, and and being very explicit in giving your tithes and even going above and beyond what is required. And then after you became a Pharisee, after you made your pledge before the scribe, then you were part of this association, and then you had assemblies. You had a common meal on Friday evening at the beginning of the Sabbath, and you just lived under these rules. And part of these rules is you could be expelled as a member of the Pharisees if you did not live according to these rules. So Pharisees distinguished from scribes. We often hear scribes and Pharisees in the gospel. Sometimes the distinction is not made clear between the two. They're often lumped together in Matthew and Luke. We hear the scribes and the Pharisees came and did this and that. Mark and John never used the term scribes and Pharisees. Matthew, the slide here says, unfortunate that Matthew unites the two groups and doesn't highlight any differences between the two, whereas Luke does. But keep in mind, Matthew is primarily writing to a Jewish audience who knows the difference between the scribes and the Pharisees, whereas Luke is writing to a Gentiles primarily. So he is telling them what the difference is between the two parties. Luke does this in the passages here, Luke 11, and then between the practice of the scribes and the practice of the Pharisees. I've summarized those three slides. They're kind of busy, so I summarized them in the table here. This comes from Luke, describing the differences between the scribes and the Pharisees. And these are the reproaches that Jesus gives to the scribes and the Pharisees in these passages. Now it says the scribes are guilty of imposing strict religious laws on the people while avoiding these same laws for themselves. Of course, they are the teachers of the laws. They know the laws and they know the loopholes in these laws. So they have ways of getting around some of those, but they hold the people in a strict accordance to these laws because they don't know the loopholes. They build tombs for the prophets, while at the same time, they're the ones who condemn some of these prophets to death. So it's kind of hypocritical on them. Jesus calls them sometimes whitewashed tombs. They keep all the knowledge that they have acquired through learning, all this knowledge, they keep it from the people. But yet they don't make any use of this knowledge for themselves on how to live. So they're hypocritical in that manner. They have great pride in their dress, their salutations in the marketplace and that sort of thing. And they get preferential seating within the synagogues. You could easily tell a scribe because of the fancy way that they dress. Unlike, it said that the Pharisees were modest, but the scribes, they tended to dress very fancy. The Pharisees are primarily ridiculed or rebuked for their hypocrisy in the way they live. They are hypocrisy in carrying out the laws externally, but not being internally pure. So that was one of them. The other one is their hypocrisy in paying the tithes on green and dry vegetables, which were not required by the law, while neglecting the religious and moral obligations of the law. We have some of these where they use the law for their own benefit. One mention is where instead of taking care of their elderly parents, they'll say, well, I've pledged this to the Lord, so I can't help you out, that sort of thing. But one thing to keep in mind here about the scribes is that most of the scribes were also Pharisees. So some of these things here, this hypocrisy, not only applied to the Pharisees, but the scribes who were also Pharisees, these laws would have also applied to them. Now, here's some examples, a couple of explicit examples of the strictness of the Pharisees. One was with regard to the merchants in Jerusalem. This is with regard to doing the tithes. There were in Jerusalem wine and oil merchants whose conscientiousness led them to fill 300 jars with froth from the wine, the bubbles from the wine, which was sold, and 300 jars with oil, which remained in their measuring cups when they were selling it. They delivered the 300 jars of the froth and 300 jars of the oil. They delivered it to the temple treasurers because they could not consider that these leavings were their property because they had technically sold them. Thus, in all probability, they were Pharisees. So they tithed on the remainders that were left in the measuring cups. Now, here's another one with regard to strictness. Women, when they went out in public, they were supposed to have their hair covered at all times when they were outside of their house. But there were women so strict that they did not once uncover the head in their house, that they did not once uncover the head even while in their own house. Women like Kimhit, who, it was said, saw 7 sons admitted to the high priesthood, which was regarded as divine reward for her extreme propriety. She said, "May this and that happen to me if even the beams of my house have ever seen the hair of my head uncovered." So she went an above and beyond. You wonder, did she ever wash her hair? Next, the Sadducees. That guy on the left, he looks stern, doesn't he? The Sadducees are those that compose the second order, first being the Pharisees, and take away destiny or fate entirely and suppose that God is not concerned in our doing or not doing what is evil. That's a very pessimistic approach, saying that God isn't concerned whether we do good or bad. And they say that to act what is good and what is evil is at man's own choice, and that the one or the other belongs, so that to everyone that they may act as they please. They take away the belief in the immortal duration of the soul and punishments and rewards in Hades. They take away the belief of the resurrection. Moreover, the Pharisees are friendly to one another and are for the exercise of concord and regards to the public. So the Pharisees are friendly to one another, but the behavior of the Sadducees one toward another is in some degree wild, and their conversation with those that are of their own party is as barbarous as if they were strangers. So Pharisees are friendly to one another. Apparently, from what Josephus says, the Sadducees are not even friendly to one another. Reminded me of what Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount. He says, "If you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? And if you greet only your brothers, what more do you have? What more are you doing than others? Do not even the Gentiles do the same?" Well, apparently, the Sadducees don't do this. So, from this, apparently the tax collectors and the Gentiles are, with regard to friendliness, they're better than the Sadducees. The doctrine of the Sadducees is this, that souls die with the bodies, no resurrection, nor do they regard the observation of anything besides what the law enjoins them. For they think it an instance of virtue to dispute with those teachers of the philosophy whom they frequent. So they like to dispute with teachers. But this doctrine is received by a few, yet by those still of the greatest dignity. So only a few people have this doctrine, but it is the highest classes of citizens. It's the high priesthood and the elders of the people. But they are able to do almost nothing of themselves, for when they become magistrates, as they are unwilling and by force sometimes obliged to do. So this is kind of interesting. They're not really interested in those positions of leadership. They addict themselves not to the notions of the Pharisees, but because the multitude would not otherwise bear them. So they have to comply with what the Pharisees want them to do in regard to temple worship. Otherwise, the multitude wouldn't do anything they say. So how do you get to be a Sadducee? It's nothing you can do. It's who you are. You're basically born into it. A lot of the Sadducees are wealthy, landowning aristocrats born into noble families. So there's no taking any vows or anything. Basically, it's not what you do, it's who you are. Here we see some mentions of Pharisees and Sadducees in the Gospels. We see that John never even mentions the Sadducees, mostly Matthew and mostly in the book of Acts. And we see it in the Acts primarily because the apostles were teaching in the temple area and the Sadducees had control of the temple area. And then we move on to the Essenes. Not mentioned in the New Testament. Philo of Alexandria, he was a Hellenizing Jew who was born in Alexandria, Egypt. He lived from 20 BC to 50 AD, and he believed a person could live both as a Hellenist and still be a Jew. He writes, there's a portion of those people called the Essenes, in number about 4,000, who derive their name from their piety, though not according to any accurate form of the Grecian dialect, because they are above all men devoted to the service of God, not sacrificing living animals, but studying rather to preserve their own minds in a state of holiness and purity. Almost think of them like monks living in sanctuaries. Josephus writes this: the doctrine of the Essenes is that all things are best ascribed to God. They teach the immortality of the soul, so that is similar to what the Pharisees do. And they esteem that the rewards of righteousness are to be earnestly striven for. And when they send what they have dedicated to God into the temple, they do not offer sacrifices, because they have more pure lustrations of their own. Now, when I read Josephus, I make sure I have a dictionary handy. Lustrations is not in there. I looked it up in Google, looked it up in Webster. I would take it to mean offerings or service. They do not offer sacrifices because they have more pure offerings or service of their own, on which account they are excluded from the common court of the temple. They are excluded from the common court of the temple. That's the court of the Gentiles, and anyone supposedly can go there, but they don't. But they offer their sacrifices themselves. So what is the sacrifice they offer? We'll find out. Yet is their course of life better than that of other men? And they entirely dict themselves to animal husbandry, raising animals and agriculture. So they're primarily into agriculture, primarily farmers, you might say. So from what Josephus says here, the Essenes didn't go to the Jewish festivals or to the temple to offer sacrifices there. And that might be the reason that we never see them, read them about them in the New Testament, because they didn't live in the area which Jesus and the disciples would have passed through. Okay, so if they didn't offer animal sacrifices, the Dead Sea Scrolls, which were found at Qumran, which is where the Essenes live, the Dead Sea Scrolls claimed that prayer was an acceptable sacrifice. And then here it's the Damascus document, which one of the Dead Sea Scrolls, 1QS column, that's cave 1, Qumran scroll, and then it's in the scroll, it's column 9. So that's the nomenclature on how you read a Dead Sea Scroll. And then here's a passage. This is from the Tanakh, which is the Hebrew Bible. And this is from Hosea 14, verses 1 and 2. It says, "Return, O Israel, to the Lord your God, for you have fallen because of your sin. Take words with you and return to the Lord. Say to him, forgive all guilt and accept what is good. Instead of bulls, we will pay the offering of our lips." So instead of offering bulls, we're going to pay the offering of our lips. So let's look at this in some different versions. This is the Tanakh we just read from Hosea. "Instead of bulls, we will pay the offering of our lips." This apparently is a difficult passage to translate because these three passages were four different versions we're going to look at have a different take on it. The ESV has "take away all iniquity, accept what is good, and we will pay with bulls the vows of our lips." So that's a little bit different reading. NIV, "Forgive all our sins and receive us graciously, that we may offer the fruit of our lips." No mention of bulls here at all. "We may offer the fruit of our lips." And then we'll go to the Net Bible, the New English Translation, "that we may offer the praise of our lips as sacrificial bulls." And this praise of the lips is prayer. Okay, so if the Jews are no longer doing sacrifice today, no longer offering sacrifice because they don't have the temple, so what do Jews do instead of offering sacrifice? This is from the Wikipedia entry for korban, which is the Jewish word for a sacrificial offering. When sacrifices were offered in ancient times, they were offered as a fulfillment of the biblical commandments. Those are found in, of course, in Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers. Since there is no longer a temple today, and the Essenes wouldn't go to the temple, they wouldn't go to the temple primarily because they thought, and rightfully so, that the leadership at the temple was corrupt, and in fact it was. Since there is no longer a temple, modern religious Jews instead pray or give tzedakah, which is righteousness or charity, instead, to atone for their sins as their sacrificial offering would have accomplished. So that Jews today pray, and that is their sacrificial offering. According to Orthodox Judaism, that's the strictest form today, and that's the smallest party of Judaism. According to Orthodox Judaism, when the Messiah comes, this will not remove the requirement to keep the 613 commandments. And when the temple is rebuilt, sacrifices is offered again. So when and if the temple is rebuilt, of course, you got that dome of the rock there, and that is in the way. It also does. So Josephus did not become an Essene, but he apparently has a great amount of admiration for them, for the life that they live. It also deserves our admiration, how much they exceed all other men that addict themselves to virtue, and this in righteousness, and indeed to such a degree that it has never appeared among any other man, neither Greeks nor barbarians. This is demonstrated by the institution of theirs, which will not suffer anything to hinder them from having all things in common. That reminds you a little bit of the Christians in the early part of Acts, where they had all things in common. 5-minute warning. So that a rich man enjoys no more of his own wealth than he who hath nothing at all. So the rich, the poor, you couldn't tell the difference. There are about 4,000 men, that agrees with what Philo had said, that live in this way, and they neither marry wives nor are desirous to keep servants, as thinking that keeping servants tempts men to be unjust, and that having wives gives the handle to domestic quarrels, but as they live by themselves, they minister one to another. So no servants and no wives. For some of them, we'll see some of them do marry. The Essenes seem to have a greater affection for one another than the other sects have. Well, definitely better than the Sadducees because they have no affection. They reject pleasures as an evil, but esteem continence and the conquest over our passions to be a virtue. So have control of your passions because that's a virtue. They neglect wedlock, but they adopt other people's children while they are young and fit for learning. Train a child in the way they should go, and they will not depart from it. And they esteem them to be of their kindred and form them according to their own manners. So they adopt children while they're young and then form them to their way of life. They do not absolutely deny the fitness of marriage and the succession of mankind, thereby continued. But they guard against the lascivious behavior of women and are persuaded that none of them preserve their fidelity to one man. So they're a little bit pessimistic about women. They despise riches, and they're also very communicative, as raises our admiration. Nor is there anyone to be found among them who hath more than one another, that's having all things in common. For it is a law among them that those who come to them must let what they have be common to the whole order, inasmuch that among them there is no appearance of poverty or excess of riches. So everyone's alike, but everyone's possessions are intermingled with everyone else's possessions. And so there is, as it were, one patrimony, one brotherhood among all the brethren. They think that oil is a defilement, that's oil for the body, perfume, that sort of thing, not cooking oil. They think oil is a defilement, and if any one of them be anointed without his approbation, it is wiped off his body, for they think that to be sweaty is a good thing. And they also like to be clothed in white garments. Community entrance. There's a period here, 1 year probation. And during that time, he is excluded from the community. They give him a small hatchet and a girdle and a white garment, and he's going out to work. And when he hath given evidence during this time that he can observe a continence, he approaches nearer to their way of living and is made partaker of the waters of purification. Yet is he even now not admitted to live with them. That's after 1 year, he still can't live with them. For after this demonstration of his fortitude, he's tried for 2 more years. And then if he's worthy, then he can be an Essene. So 3 entire years. And since Josephus tried him over the 3 years, I don't think he fully completed the Essene membership. Before he's allowed to touch the common food, he's obliged to make tremendous oaths, exercise piety toward God, observe justice, won't harm anyone. He will always hate the wicked, and he will at no time ever abuse authority. Now there's another order of Essenes. These Essenes do marry, who do agree with the rest as to their way of living and customs and laws, but differ from them in the point of marriage, as thinking that by not marrying, they cut off the principal part of human life, which is procreation. Nay, rather, that if all men should be of the same opinion, the whole race of mankind would fail. And in fact, this is one of the first commands that God gave Adam and Eve, is to reproduce and multiply. They do not accompany with their wives when they are with child, as a demonstration that they do not marry out of regard to pleasure, but for the sake of posterity. So they do not have sexual relations while their wives are pregnant. Now the men go into the baths with some of their garments on, as the men do. Now the men and the women both go into the baths with their clothes on. So here's Jerusalem, and here's Qumran down by the Dead Sea. The Zealots, finally the Zealots. Of course, they were strongly opposed to the Romans. And since Josephus essentially was adopted by the Romans. They hated Josephus. But the fourth sect of the Jewish philosophy, Judas the Galilean was the author, and we read about him in Acts 5:37. These men agree in all things with the Pharisaic notions, but they have an inviolable attachment to liberty and say that God is to be their only ruler and Lord. They also do not value dying, any kind of death, nor indeed do they heed the deaths of their relations and friends, nor can any such fear make them call any man Lord. Now, we do have one zealot mentioned in the Bible, that is Simon the Zealot. And the only time Simon the Zealot, the apostle, is mentioned is when the apostles are mentioned. And Judas is always the last one mentioned, and Simon the Zealot is the second to the last one mentioned. So I think that's it. Any questions?
Warner, was there power sharing in the Sanhedrin between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and who got the presidency of the Sanhedrin?
The high priest was the president. There were 71 members. You might say, can you say the high priest is like the tiebreaker? In the Torah, Moses had gotten 70 helpers to be with him, 70 other judges. And so that's thought that's where the number came from. Of course, 70 was the number of members in the great Sanhedrin in Jerusalem. Other Sanhedrins, smaller ones, could be made up of 23 members. It seems like it was always a negative, or always an odd number.
Yeah, and was the presidency of the Sanhedrin an office that was occupied mostly by Sadducees?
It would have been a Sadducee because the high priest was a Sadducee.
Mm-hmm.
High priests and the chief priests were also there. Now the chief priests would be the high priest. It would be the 23. It would be the heads of the priestly courses. It would be the captain of the temple guard. The captain of the temple guard, you might say, he was the vice high priest or something. It sounds like he was there to keep guard, but he was actually a priest also. So
it was almost like it was set up like a senate.
Yep. Yeah, and so it really helped Paul there that he knew that that there were Pharisees and Sadducees, and that he says he was only guilty of having the same belief system as the Pharisees had. So,
he was very astute.
Yeah.
Thank you, Warner, very much.
Yeah, and I found out it's not easy reading Josephus.
Warner. Warner.
Yeah. Yes.
I have a question that's been on my mind ever since we started this study. Where was the tribe of Judah during all that 400 years?
Well, they were Judah and Benjamin came back from the Babylonian captivity.
Yeah, they were right there.
Yeah, Zerubbabel was actually a descendant of David, so he was of the tribe of Judah. So
and so we
Benjamin.
Yeah, the tribe of Judah had to be preserved during that 400 years because Christ came.
Yes, Judah, and we know Judah because of Jesus. We know the Levites because they had the priesthood. We know Benjamin. Benjamin was Paul. Paul was of the tribe of Benjamin. And then there's one other tribe that gets a mention in the New Testament. And remember when Jesus was brought to the temple and he met Simeon and Anna was of the tribe of Asher. So we know there's at least that there was Asher, Judah, Benjamin, and Levi.
Yeah, I just wondered what happened to them all during that 400 years. They were just in with the different beliefs going on at the time.
Yes, they were there. They were the Maccabees. You know, they were Levites, and
Okay.
so
That
so
helped me.
they were around, and they were keeping their genealogy. Like Josephus, he claimed his genealogy through his great grandmother, and for the priesthood, the matrimonial, the lineage through the female side was very important. Someone who's if a woman was taken into captivity by a foreign force, any children of hers were disqualified from the priesthood.
Thanks a whole bunch. You've helped me a bunch.
All right. Thank you. You going to the building? Or you staying home?
Thank you for these good lessons.
You're welcome. Everyone stay safe. And if you're driving to the building, just take care. I don't think the roads are slippery, just cold mainly.
Thanks, Werner.
Welcome. Next week will be, what's next week? Next week is the synagogue. So we'll go through, trace the synagogue. Very important during the New Testament times, and especially during the time of Acts.